So there's a user on Instagram who started her video by saying, and her name is Emory, neuroscience shows beating a dead horse with your friends is actually great for your brain and may delay Alzheimer's. Retelling past events practices something called Hebb's Law. Actually, I did not know the first person who posted this because there was a video on TikTok I came across saying, and have you heard about the scientists who found out that beating a dead horse actually prevents Alzheimer's?
Because did you guys see that a scientist who studies Alzheimer's, she said recalling memories is one of the best ways to prevent it. So next time someone tells you to stop beating a dead horse, tell them you're beating Alzheimer's.
So I had to look for her. It took a lot to find her. And then in this video, we're going to look at how forgiveness is linked to cognitive decline as well as Hebb's Law in Alzheimer's prevention. Yeah, I ended up thinking a lot and writing a lot because I was like, beating a dead horse reminds me of a podcast I did, a podcast episode called The Shape of Forgiveness. I've linked it in the description box below. And we have fun examples too, and we start with defining Alzheimer's, then looking at Hebb's Law. This is gonna be a long video, just so you know. Alzheimer's is a progressive brain disorder and the most common cause of dementia, accounting for 60% to 80% of cases. It slowly destroys memory, thinking skills, and the ability to carry out simple tasks. While there is no cure, treatments can help manage symptoms. And then when you look at Hebb's Law, because I think learning a new language or learning a new skill, whether it's pottery, whether it's carpentry, crocheting, or beadwork, can actually prevent dementia, Alzheimer's. Hebb's Law or Hebbian theory states that when two brain cells activate at the same time over and over, their connection grows stronger. This basic rule explains how we learn and form habits. Neurons that fire together wire together. And Emory actually said that in her video, neurons that fire together wire together. And that also describes Hebb's Law. An example of Hebb's Law, dream recall and journaling. That means journaling your dreams, learning a new language, coding, mathematics. So I went through a number of studies. I actually looked up a number of studies and I found this it's actually a research paper. Poor dream recall associates with Alzheimer's disease, biomarkers, and dementia risks. The discussion section of the abstract said, poor dream recall in later life may be a novel and easily assessed indicator of early neurodegeneration. And then I looked at another study titled, The Effect of Dream Report Collection and Dream Incorporation on Memory Consolidation During Sleep. Now, this one to me felt like, I don't know, when I was reading it, I felt like, is it that I do not understand what these guys are researching? Or was this part of a bigger research? Because when I was reading it, I was like, it almost gives pointers to what I'm looking for, where the question was, do you think writing down your dreams can reduce your Alzheimer's risk? But it also felt like it was touching on other things. And this discussion section of this paper indicates that collecting dream reports during sleep doesn't generally disturb memory retention. It also highlights that higher incorporation of learning stimuli into non-rapid eye movement dreams, but not rapid eye movement dreams, predicts better memory retention, suggesting a link between memory consolidation and during an REM sleep. It's almost like they were trying to look at memory consolidation during REM versus NREM sleep. And I wrote, to me, this sounded like if you're woken up from your sleep to report about what you dreamt, your memory is not affected. Of which it makes me feel like there's another hypothesis here that somebody could test and use this. Does interfering with people's sleep interfere with their memory quality? Like if you keep on being woken up from your sleep, maybe you're in a noisy area, maybe you're growing up in a household that has a lot of violence or disruptions, or you have to wake up early to go to work and you have an alarm and the alarm rings. Would that interfere with your memory? The beginning, I was talking about a podcast episode about forgiveness, and to me, I was like, I think being forgiving increases your risk of developing Alzheimer's. And then here, forgiving and forgetting as a risk factor to Alzheimer's. That was what I was looking for. And I found this research titled Hostility, Forgiveness, and Cognitive Impairment over 10 years in a national sample of American adults. And I had two things I was also checking. What are the side effects of not being forgiving? Being an unforgiving person, what are the side effects? And then what are the side effects of being forgiving? This is what I found from the paper. We hypothesized that greater hostility at baseline would predict more cognitive impairment 10 years later, and that this effect would be moderated by forgiveness, such that individuals exhibiting greater self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others at baseline would show weaker associations between their baseline hostility levels and cognitive impairment 10 years later as compared to those exhibiting less forgiveness and forgiveness of others at baseline. That was the hypothesis. And now I was wondering, from reading this study, is self-forgiveness more beneficial than forgiving others when it comes to cognitive impairment? Think about it for 3 seconds. What do you think? Yes or no? Is self-forgiveness much better, or is forgiving others much better? Or are they at the same level? This research indicates that self-forgiveness is more beneficial than forgiving others when it comes to cognitive impairment, specifically because it was shown to mitigate the negative effects of hostility, while forgiveness of others did not show a similar protective effect. Therefore, when we look at my 2021 podcast episode, The Shape of Forgiveness, I was right when I said, now we're talking about something I did in 2021, we're in 2026, when I said, you're allowed to hold on to the event for as long as you want. Healing is not linear. When someone does something bad to you, you need to heal. Everyone heals uniquely, but you know what else? Healing does not cover the bruise, scab, or wound. Healing also does not reach an end in all people. Sometimes it halts. When you have a cut on your finger, depending on how deep it is, a scar will form. Some scars are tiny while others are big. Some people form keloids from any type of cut or injury. A keloid is a type of raised scar. Then, some cuts or bruises never heal. They stay open forever. No matter what someone tries to do to cover it or make it heal, it never does. There are also injuries that get worse the more one tries to treat them. Some are best left alone. This is why forgiveness is not about the offended, but the offender. If you go and listen to the podcast episode, you can also read, the transcript is on WordPress. If you go listen to the podcast episode or you go read the transcript, you will see there's a part I was talking about who is forgiveness really about. Is it the person who deserves forgiveness? Or is it the person withholding the forgiveness? Because we are told being unforgiving is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And I also asked, have you seen someone who is looking for forgiveness? Something else I said, and it was towards the end of the podcast, end of the podcast episode rather. And if anyone deserves forgiveness so they can be free, it's you, yourself. The only type of forgiveness that will set you free is self-forgiveness. Forgive yourself for any injustice you served yourself. Forgive yourself for tolerating things that hurt you. Forgive yourself for not seeing your worth. As usual, remember to love the shape of you. That was from my podcast episode titled The Shape of Forgiveness. And now we also want to look at trauma and dementia. So far, we have looked at Hebb's Law. We've looked at whether writing your dreams reduces your risk of developing Alzheimer's. We've looked at forgiving and forgetting as a risk factor to Alzheimer's. We haven't touched on the forgetting part. We'll touch on it later on. And then now we want to look at trauma and dementia. Traumatic life events and risk for dementia, a systematic review and meta-analysis. That's another research paper I found. And let me read for you what was in that paper. This was in the discussion section, by the way. This must have been in the first part of the discussion section, because I know like the first part was interesting and like the third paragraph of this discussion segment was also interesting. Let me read for you that first paragraph. This review found that TLE, traumatic life events, are associated with an increased risk of dementia. Subtypes of trauma occurring in childhood or in war also increase dementia risk, though this conclusion is based on fewer studies. Gunak et al. Established an association between PTSD and risk for all-cause dementia. While we excluded studies that directly investigated PTSD, It is likely that traumatic life events can cause subclinical symptoms. The mechanism by which post-traumatic stress depression and traumatic life events increase the risk of developing dementia are not fully understood, but are likely to be similar. Altered activity in psychological, including repetitive negative thinking, and neurological pathways, including the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, oxidative stress, and a reduction in volume of the hippocampi as a result of trauma may play a part in increasing dementia risk. Recognizing that PTSD and negative sequelae of traumatic life events are potentially modifiable risks for dementia and understanding the mechanisms by which they increase vulnerability to dementia may allow the creation of interventions to specifically target these mechanisms and reduce the effect of trauma and PTSD on dementia. And now, when I was reading this discussion, when I got to paragraph 4, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And there were 3 other studies that were done, and they were talking about how there are other things that they feel would contribute to dementia, but they didn't quite find directly. But here we have, I wrote down 3 things I found from that paragraph. Women may have underreported abuse because they did not recognize the behavior as abusive, or because of shame, not feeling safe to report, or for some other reason. Survival bias may also have been a factor to account for our findings. And the third reason was individuals who experience the most severe traumatic life events may be underrepresented in older cohorts, as premature death is linked to stress and trauma. So because premature death is linked to stress and trauma, it's been difficult to find older populations to do this research on. Something else. Research shows that, okay, this was me who wrote, research shows that learning a new skill, we're looking at Hebb's law again, reduces the risk of Alzheimer's, is a line I picked from a TikTok video a month ago or years ago.
You need to do a puzzle. If you've been working on Sudokus, try a different one. You've mastered a Sudoku, I promise. Okay? You have to learn new skills, and you have to keep challenging your brain. And you have to keep recalling memories, you know?
So I'm referring to this study by Harvard Health Publishing titled Train Your Brain. Yeah, I went to check. Does learning a new skill reduce your risk of Alzheimer's? I either heard that line in a TikTok video earlier on in the year, or it might have been last year. Not years ago, probably last year, if not earlier on in the year. And now let me read for you what is in this article. Embracing a new activity that also forces you to think and learn and requires ongoing practice can be one of the best ways to keep the brain healthy. These tips can support your new brain training endeavor. Now, these are the tips that they give. You pick one new activity, you sign up for a class, you schedule practice time, and no matter which new activity you choose, it's best to follow 3 guidelines in order to maximize brain training. It has to be challenging, it has to be complex, there has to be complexity, practice, and your activity should require some level of constant practice. But the goal is not to strive for vast improvements. It's the constant repetition of working to improve, and not the quest for mastery, that can have the greatest impact. What about hobbies you already have? Yes, the hobby you have or the skill you have, if you increase the difficulty level, then you're still practicing Hebb's law. In a sense, you're still practicing Hebb's law, and you're going to be able to improve your brain health. When you look at everything we've spoken about so far, we've read, we can also see that neuroplasticity is somewhere here. Now, something else I wanted to know, do high cortisol levels and stress cause Alzheimer's? And I found an article titled, Can Stress Cause Dementia? And it's by the Alzheimer's organization, www.alzheimers.org.uk. And let me read for you what they say. This is what I wrote, not directly. However, this article by Alzheimer's Society explains the link between stress and dementia. They say, a key hormone released when you're stressed, cortisol, has been linked to problems with memory. Stress is also closely linked to conditions such as depression and anxiety. These have also been suggested as factors that could increase the risk of dementia. Increased levels of cortisol in the body can affect brain regions such as the hippocampus, which is critical for memory. And I want to go back to this study where we're looking at The one I looked at, paragraph 3, traumatic life events and risk for dementia, a systemic review and meta-analysis, where I was looking at trauma and dementia. And there's a part here where they said, altered activity in psychological, including negative repetitive thinking, and neurological pathways, including the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And there's a part here they did mention about the hippocampi, but I know we read it somewhere there. If you rewind the video, you'll find it. And you're seeing here, according to Alzheimer's, increased levels of cortisol in the body can affect brain regions such as the hippocampus, which is critical for memory. Stress also affects the immune system, which is known to play an important role in the development of dementia. Stress can lead to the release of chemical signals that trigger inflammation in the body and brain. Chronic inflammation in the brain can damage cells and affect how well brain cells communicate. So, what can we conclude about the question? Does forgiveness cause Alzheimer's? Not directly, not a no, not a yes. However, if forgiving others raises your cortisol levels, you increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's. That is, if you being forgiving is making you stressed, the thought of being forgiving and then also choosing the forgiveness is stressing you up, your cortisol levels are going to go up, your risk of developing Alzheimer's is going to go up. If your definition of forgiveness is about suppression, that is forgetting and moving on, then you could develop physical symptoms of that suppression. In psychology, those are psychosomatic symptoms. And forgetting means reintroducing yourself to the same uncomfortable environment over and over again, re-traumatizing yourself. This is constant exposure to stressful events, which can cause PTSD, which is linked to dementia. So if you ask me, as Michelle, does forgiveness cause Alzheimer's? Yes, though indirectly. All the resources linked in the description box below. I've also linked the podcast episode. I've linked the podcast episode and I've linked the podcast transcript in the description box below. And as you've been watching this video, you have seen the different timestamps, like the years of this research. And you're also seeing when I did my podcast episode. So yeah, we need to study forgiveness and Alzheimer's, or rather, we need to study the link between forgiveness and cognitive impairment. Cognitive impairment, neurodegeneration, yeah.